Okay, I have 3 o'clock Eastern. Should we start, Ruth?
Yeah, absolutely.
Welcome everyone. This is the 𝗢𝗎𝗪 first ever live stream, and we are doing an interview and a Q&A session with Dr. Ruth Lanius from Canada. And the purpose of our meeting today is in part to raise awareness about the course that's upcoming. It will start next Tuesday at 3 p.m. Eastern. And it's a 6-part course that's being taught by Ruth Lanius. And I just want to give you a little description about who she is, and then we'll get right into the heart of kind of what we're talking about. Ruth Lanius is an MD and a PhD. She's one of the leading clinical neuroscience researchers in the study of the traumatized brain, and one of the few who's focused her research on the importance of neurofeedback in the treatment of trauma. She's co-author of Healing the Traumatized Self, Consciousness, Neuroscience, and Treatment. Excuse me, I think I read that wrong. With Paul Fruin, PhD, right?
That's right, yeah.
And co-editor of Impact of Early Life Trauma on Health and Disease, the Hidden Epidemic with 𝗟𝗑𝗏. Am I saying that right?
Yeah, that's right.
And Claire Payne. The claim which you've disputed is that she has published 150 research articles. Is that right, Ruth?
I think so, yeah.
Okay, all right. Maybe the earlier number that you disputed was 1,500 research articles, because I recall you saying, no, not that many. Yeah. So welcome everyone. I'm gonna ask a few questions to kind of warm us up a little bit, and then we are gonna open it up for your questions. And we're streaming live on YouTube, so if you're uncomfortable with being seen on the internet, then this is probably one of those cases where you don't want to show your camera. And then the comments, you can either comment on the YouTube channel or you can comment here in the Zoom channel. So welcome everyone. I think what I'd like to start out with is a kind of origin story, Ruth. How did you get into doing this kind of work and studying trauma and neuroscience in particular?
Sure, and first of all, good afternoon, everybody. Hope you're all well, and I look forward to an hour of discussion. Yeah, so how did all this start? I have a background in that I did a PhD in neuroscience, so I've always been really interested in the brain, Lars. And it actually stems back to my grade 12 biology. I won an award for grade 12 biology, and I received a book about the brain. And since then, I've been really fascinated by this really complex organ. And so I think this is what led me to pursue a PhD in neuroscience, because I thought this was just an amazing thing, the brain. And then, I combined that with an interest in medicine. And what really got me into trauma was when I did my internship. My first month of my internship was in psychiatry. And it was on a little inpatient unit in London, Ontario, with predominantly traumatized clients, even though they weren't labeled as that at the time. And I started talking to the traumatized individuals and learning from them. And I thought their stories were just amazing. And I was so impressed by the resilience of these individuals. And I thought it was so fascinating how the brain could adapt to these horrendous situations. And of course, this allowed people to survive, really adapting both brain, mind, and body to these situations. And at the same time, there was an individual, Peter Williamson, who was in the department who was doing neuroimaging. And London, Ontario was one of the first places that had a really sophisticated imager. And so, he offered me the opportunity to do some imaging with traumatized individuals, because he knew I was becoming really interested in that area. And so, soon after, I was able to set up a few experiments using neuroimaging, really starting with the individual's first-person perspective, what they experienced, and then really allowing to ask some questions. what happens when people remember their traumatic event. And what we learned very soon was that people could respond very differently to trauma, as we all know as clinicians. And we learned that people could become really hyper-aroused and have too much emotion, relive the trauma, or they could recall the trauma and be very detached and shut down, that typical kind of stress response. And we were able to outline these two very distinct brain and first-person perspective responses. And the work sort of developed from there, but that's the origin. But it really started working with traumatized individuals and really learning from them, and being so impressed by the resilience and how the brain and mind and body could adapt to such experience.
That's great, thank you. I wonder if you could talk a little bit about one of the things that we've been discussing in the conversations with Sieber and Fisher and elsewhere is the clinical implications of particularly your most recent discoveries of how the traumatized brain responds. And I wonder if you could talk, maybe begin in general terms about what the clinical implications of studying the neuroscience of trauma are in your view.
I think what's really helpful about having these brain images is that it makes an invisible injury visible, right? And we know how often people with mental illness are stigmatized because their suffering is very frequently invisible. Right? And so I just think by having these images now, it shows people, there's actually something different in these brains. And not only, I think, has it helped to destigmatize mental illness, I think it's also been incredibly helpful in validating for the traumatized clients who've often been, treated very poorly in the system and often been told, oh, just get over it, because their difficulties haven't been fully understood. And so that's what I hear from our research participants very often, that they found this extremely validating, and they often have a great interest in learning some of the underlying mechanisms of their difficulties, and so they're always very eager to get the results from the studies and understand more.
Okay. Thank you. The neuroscience is a very trendy topic at the moment. A lot of people want to talk about the brain in particular. Thankfully, there is more attention being drawn to trauma. I wonder, as a researcher and neuroscientist and a doctor and a clinician, you do therapy with folks still. What strikes you as some of the things that people misunderstand sort of commonly about the brain or about trauma in general?
I think we've come a long way, but I think we're still seeing the brain, mind, and body too disconnected. And I think it's really one. And I think that's really important to keep fostering. I think we're still suffering from some of what Descartes wrote about, right? That the brain, mind, and body are very separate. And I think if we can only really progress if we see all three as one unit. And of course, then there's the soul as well that we need to incorporate into our thinking. So I think that's one issue. I think what is still problematic too is that clinicians and researchers still, I think, are too separate. And I think we need to bring those two camps together. And not just clinicians and researchers, but also people with lived experience, right? And I think we really need to have all three parties present at these discussions, because there can be incredible cross-fertilization among those three parties. And I think this really speaks to how we conduct research in our group, is that it always starts with the first person experience, right? So it always starts with the traumatized clients. We talk to them, we try to understand where they're coming from, And it's really from those first-person perspectives that we develop our research questions and our research designs, and that we try to understand how brain, mind, and body underlie those responses to trauma. And so I think that's something we really need to focus on. And I think that's why I have loved these webinars with 𝗂𝗎, because, you know, all three parties are present here. And I think it's led to some incredibly fruitful discussion. And I really look forward to more of that, because we can all learn from each other, right? I always say to my students, you know, we know so little, and we have to be extremely humble, because, you know, the brain, mind, and body are so complex. So we start with the common knowledge that we know very little, and we all need to come together to learn. And I really hope that this is what this webinar is going to be all about.
Thank you. So you touched on this a little bit. It does seem that there has historically been a real divide between the science of studying the brain and the therapy of helping people to recover. And one of the things that I've heard talked about by EEGer clinicians in particular is the importance of therapy. Can you talk about how the therapeutic relationship plays a role in the, you know, in brain development and recovery from trauma and that kind of thing?
Yeah, I think the therapeutic relationship is absolutely at the core of everything we do, as we know. And it's really through that relationship, which of course for the traumatized client is very difficult, because they were often hurt at the hands of caregivers, right? And so I think it's really important for us to appreciate how stressful it may be for the traumatized individual to sit with us in the office and to really explore that, and to really very slowly establish more of a sense of safety. But I think you really need that relationship to, you know, to do any foundational work, right? And if that trusting relationship is present, then you can go to some of those very painful places. You can approach some of the self states that wouldn't otherwise be approachable. And you can really, I think, build on restoring the sense of self through all different modalities. And I think that's something else that we're really going to focus on in the webinar, you know, how we can use an integrative approach using as many modalities as possible to really help the individual. But again, I really think the therapeutic relationship is the foundation of any work we do.
Thank you. I know one of the sessions, the first time that I read it, it seemed to me an extremely specific sort of focus. But then as I thought about it more and then read more of sort of what your introduction to it is, this idea that for trauma, for survivors of trauma, the eye contact itself is an intimidating and possibly dysregulating phenomena. Can you talk about what's happening there?
Sure. And again, this is something I learned from my traumatized clients, and I often observed that eye contact was very painful for them. And, you know, often they looked down, they couldn't look me in the eye, which of course is very consistent with a shame posture. And then a few years ago, as I was working on the book with 𝗂𝗂𝗪, I did an interview with a Vietnam veteran. And, you know, his response to our question, we asked this question to a number of individuals, and the question was, what's it like for you to make eye contact? And he said to me, I cannot look anyone in the eye for fear that they will see the stain on my soul. And as he said that to me, I thought, wow, this is it, right? And he really opened my thinking more into, you know, what it is like for traumatized clients to make eye contact. And as I talked to some of my childhood trauma clients, you know, they kept telling me, you know, when I look someone in the eye, they will see what a terrible person I am. So a different variation of what the Vietnam veteran had told me. And so, you know, I said to my group, you know, we really need to study the neurobiology underlying eye contact, because eye contact is such a key component of social interactions in most cultures. And as we got the results from that study, sure enough, what we saw was that in traumatized individuals, when they were exposed to direct eye contact through an avatar, they only light up the reptilian brain, sort of the defensive response. Whereas individuals who hadn't been traumatized activated higher areas in the cortex involved with social interactions. And so these areas can help us to know what the other's feeling, they can help us to know what we're feeling, and they can help us to really gauge, is this a safe interaction or isn't it a safe interaction? But if you don't have those higher areas involved, you can't reflect and mentalize the relationship. And this is exactly what happened to the traumatized clients. And so, of course, this raises a number of really important questions, including the intergenerational transmission of trauma. And, this is one webinar we'll be talking about because I think it's so essential, for social interactions, for being able to utilize social support after trauma, which we know is so protective.
So I'm gathering that one of the kind of underlying themes of this approach is, I would say, is something that is not widely understood. This idea that people who have sustained particularly developmental trauma, but maybe any kind of trauma, that their brains are fundamentally working in different ways than people who have not undergone that same level of sustained threat. Is that an accurate statement?
Absolutely. And, our group has studied so many different brain systems now, the fear system, the balance system, and, just as a couple of examples. And we find different connectivity really in almost every system that we study. And I think this is not a cause for alarm. I think it actually shows how adaptive the brain is, right? It's a brain that is connected, of course, to a body that needs to adapt to horrendous experience. And so the way it does it is by altering connectivity to really help the individual survive. The problem is, once you've reached the aftermath of trauma and you're living in the present, focusing on the past and, being ready to be threatened and hurt all the time doesn't work anymore for living in the present. And so now our job as therapists is, how do we help the brain rewire, and not just rewire within the brain, but also rewire to the body to help it live, the individual live in the present and really have the fullest quality of life. And again, we're going to be talking about a very integrative approach, using a number of therapeutic techniques, the therapeutic relationship being at the foundation, and also how to use modalities such as neurofeedback and neurostimulation for that can really help facilitate some of those changes in brain connectivity that we need to achieve.
I wonder if we could kind of switch tracks and maybe go backwards a little bit. You were talking about the different ways in which traumatized individuals respond to events, from how people who have not sustained, consistent, constant trauma. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit. One of the questions that I received over email had to do with the different ways that people experience past and present. And that itself, and I've heard Bessel van der Kolk talk about the idea that for traumatized individuals, the trauma is ever present. Can you talk a little bit about the physioneurology, the neurophysiology that's involved in that?
Sure, and yeah, I think often what traumatized individuals tell us is that they have a loss of time, right? And that, they feel like they're back in the past, reliving the flashbacks. And of course, that can be on a continuum, right? Some people are fully back there, they lose touch with the present altogether, and other people are reliving the trauma as well as still having some awareness of the present. But I think, what has been shown is that, when we live the trauma, the parts of the brain that help us to have a sense of time, which include the anterior insula and the front part of the cortex, actually are offline. And those are also parts of the brain that help us to create a narrative. And so those parts are offline, and it's not until somebody engages in treatment that some of those parts come back online. And once they come back online, that also gives the individual that self-reflective capacity, right? That capacity to be mindful of what happened. And as you develop that self-reflective capacity, that comes along with a sense of time, right? Because you can now stand back and reflect on it. And that means you're no longer reliving the experience, or you're no longer in the experience. But this notion of a sense of time, I think, is really important. And as we move to individuals who have more complex dissociative disorders, often they tell us, I've lost my sense of time altogether. And I think we can relate this to different self states experiencing different senses of time. So some self states are still living like it is the past, and some self states are quite aware that it is the present. And then when you put that all together, often that reflects a complete loss of time.
Interesting. So you were talking a little bit about what the different parts coming online, that are different for traumatized individuals as for so-called healthy individuals. Can you talk? One of the sort of groundbreaking things that, as I understand it, that's come out of your lab is this idea that the way that the DMN comes out, the default mode network comes online, is very different for people who have undergone trauma than for people who aren't, and the sort of implications for risk-taking behavior. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So the default mode network, just to review it, is a brain network that's really active at rest. And it's thought to really reflect the sense of self that we have. And in individuals who haven't been traumatized, this network usually comes online fully by late adolescence. And it involves areas that are involved in memory recall, areas involved in helping us know what we feel, having a future, and also brain areas that help us to have an embodied sense of ourselves. In trauma, this default mode network, or the sense of self network, is very disconnected. And we don't have any areas involved that help us know that there's a future, that help us to know what we feel.
Oops. I'm sorry, Ruth, I just turned off your microphone because I was trying to get rid of ambient noise. And Zoom is not letting me unmute you. Thank you. Sorry about that.
So this sense of self network is very disconnected in trauma, and many of the areas aren't connected. And our group has hypothesized that this may really reflect that loss of self that's often experienced by traumatized individuals, who often say, I don't know who I am. I feel like I don't exist. But what's very interesting, and we found this recently, is that under threat, even if the threat is subliminal, so not consciously perceived, if that threat is present, all of a sudden, that sense of self network starts to come online somewhat. And at first, this didn't make any sense to us. But then I started talking to a number of people who had suffered from chronic trauma, and I said, this is what we're finding, and I really don't understand it fully. Can you, does this make any sense to you? And, one woman in particular, and I'll quote what she said because it's incredibly eloquent, and I don't think anybody could say it better, is that, she explained to me, why she was engaged in shoplifting. And she said, when I was engaged in shoplifting, I had that sense of terror and hyperarousal, and that organized me. That gave me the capacity to experience a semblance of a body, a semblance of a sense of self, and some agency, which she could only experience under extreme threat. And so all of a sudden, these findings made much more sense. And we're now thinking about how this may underlie, for example, traumatic reenactments, and this seeking of reckless behavior in a lot of traumatized clients. And I think what's really nice about this is that we're starting to have a neurobiological explanation for some of these behaviors that are often put down in therapy and not understood. And I think often the traumatized individual is stigmatized when they exhibit these behaviors. So again, I think making sense of what happens in the brain, will allow us to make that invisible injury visible and to really destigmatize some of these symptoms.
Thank you. One thing that's interesting about the story that you just told is I wonder what proportion of neuroscientists and neuroscience researchers go to the people that they're studying and ask for their input into describing that thing. That seems like it makes me happy in a kind of way that that there's an immediate reference to the population that stands to benefit the most from this research. Can you talk a little bit about, as a researcher, as somebody who's gone through years of schooling, that can't be something that was taught in your school.
No, but it just makes sense. And, actually, Bessel van der Kolk always said to me, the patients are your textbook. And, he was absolutely right. And during my first 2 years of psychiatry, I didn't even open a textbook. I just listened to my patients because, they taught me so much of what I know. And I think if you listen, you'll be able to figure it out. And now sometimes as I listen, to my traumatized clients explain what they're experiencing, I'm actually seeing the brain pathways as, they're explaining this. And it's beautiful how the two mirror each other.
Interesting. I've asked some questions about the course material and what you're going to be talking about. And I'm not a neuroscientist or even a clinician. I wonder, I know from talking to you, Ruth, that you are extremely accessible and spend, a good deal of attention to the idea of making your ideas and the results of your research accessible. We've talked about it in terms of everyone being welcome for the course. Can you talk a little bit about what that means for you, the idea to make neuroscience and understanding it accessible to everyone?
Yeah, I think that's the whole point of the research, right, is to make it accessible. There's no point to do the research if we just, write these academic publications that nobody can understand because they're written in a language not everybody speaks, right? And this is what we've been thinking a lot about as a group is, how do we make these findings more accessible? And I think, having a webinar like this is a really good forum because it'll include those three parties that we've talked about, right? It'll include people with lived experience, it'll include therapists, and it'll include researchers. And I think by having that dialogue, one question I also want to ask of the group and receive feedback is, what else should we do to make this work more accessible, and to really, get the input from the group on that, because I think that's the whole point, right? Otherwise, there's no point to do the research. And so that's something that's really important to our group.
That's great. I endorse that message. And I also think that that's a great segue into opening this up. I know that several of you who are here today wrote to me with questions, but what if you asked your question directly? And as you may know already, Ruth is open to, open to challenge and questions and, discussion about the parts that are interesting and confusing. So
feel free to disagree too, right? That's how we learn, right? And I always say that to my students. I say, I would never want to hire a student I can't learn from, right? So that's how we learn, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is about learning together, right?
Sure. So I can see in the chat that Fiona has a question. Fiona, can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Lars. Hi, Ruth.
Hello.
Can you hear me? You can hear me, yeah? So my question, I'm sorry to go back a little bit, but my question is in relation to the fear factor in terms of therapy and needing to feel safe, the client needing to feel safe with the therapist because of the fear-driven brain. And I'm really interested to know, Ruth, what your opinion is on whether or not it's a good idea to educate your client, it's obviously very individual, on a little bit about how their brain works and how the brain may find that it finds ways to, for instance, not go to therapy because it doesn't feel safe. Because, and I talk from, I'm slightly different probably to everybody else in this webinar, and that I'm actually a person who's receiving your feedback. And what I find is that until I learned and understood about how my brain worked and how, when I didn't feel safe, but I didn't understand what that was, there were lots of things that I would not realize I was putting in place to stop receiving the therapy. But once I understood it, I was able to recognize those. But I don't know whether that's unique to me or whether that is recommended to be able, would that be helpful? I know it was massive for me, but is it a safe thing to do? To teach a client a little bit about their brain to understand that there could be those things coming in?
Oh, absolutely. And I do that with all my clients, right? To really help them understand, what's happening in their brains and their bodies that may frighten them and why they're frightened, right? Give them the context that, you were hurt by caregivers. And so, when you sit in an office with a caregiver, what's that like for you, right? And then they'll give some first-person account, and then, you can say, well, actually, this is also what's happening in your brain, right? What you're feeling and what you're telling about, has a relationship to what's happening in your brain and your body. And I think that also makes the individual often feel much less ashamed, right? Because there's something that's, going on in the brain.
Guilty, I think.
Yeah. It's not, so often, we call this a therapy interfering behavior or a bad behavior, right? This is not a bad behavior. It has a reason, right?
But it's such a shame there's so much stigma around that.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think by knowing that the brain is firing in a different way, it can be extremely de-shaming for individuals.
Somebody, they love being a victim. They don't understand their brain is telling them something, and they are understandably listening to it. But the brain is so intelligent; it's the signs. Even if you're looking at the connection.
Yeah, I'm having trouble hearing you, Fiona. But yeah, absolutely, their brain is telling them something, and in the past, that helped them to survive, right? So being with a caregiver and being terrified, that told them something. That told them if they can get out of here, right? But in the present, it's different.
Do you have any tips?
Yeah, I think just normalizing the experience, helping individuals understand how adaptive that was for survival, and helping them understand, that there is, changes in the brain that are fueling these responses that, again, were adaptive at the time of the trauma. But now in the present, where things are safer, it doesn't work anymore, right? Because it prevents you from coming to therapy.
And yet it's so hard to know because it can feel like instinct. And as you know, like as you know yourself, it is so strong. Are there any even tips for how they can recognize those behaviors? Because it can be sneaky. The brain is so intelligent. I even find myself sometimes, it can be 24 hours and then I go, okay. And it's almost, it can be really hard to, I don't know, maybe there isn't an answer. Maybe it's just so much up to the individual and how their brain responds. But I feel like I wish there was a checklist, you know, are you doing this? Are you doing that? So that you can recognize when it's legitimate, when a therapist maybe isn't doing something right and you're legitimately not happy, and when it's actually just misfiring.
Well, I think there's always a reason, and there's always a reason that used to be adaptive in the past. You know, another reason may be that a self-state may feel that you're not deserving of getting better, right? And so I think what's critical is that we unpack the reason, that we help the individual understand, and also understand that there is a brain correlation to this, and then how can we overcome that? Does that make sense?
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yes.
Debbie.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Debbie.
Oh, thank you. I just wanted to say that I agree with what Fiona just said. I've been doing neurofeedback for about 3.5 years for developmental trauma. And when I took Seaburn's 16-week webinar on neurofeedback, developmental trauma, and the integration of psychotherapy, everything shifted for me. For the first time, I felt like I wasn't a failure at life, but I never really had a fighting chance. And after I understood what Seaburn was teaching about the brain and developmental trauma, everything just changed for me. I saw that I felt like my brain is, in one way, the reason that it was protective at the time. It's the reason I'm in the state that I'm in now, but my brain is also the way out for me, taking care of my brain. And the other thing that really helped me was my current neurofeedback provider, who does clinical neurofeedback. It's the first time I've had clinical neurofeedback, which was a huge shift for me and really important. One day he said to me, he explained that my brain developed in an environment of abuse and neglect and chaos and trauma. And most of my adult life was the same. And when he said that, and I don't know why, but for the first time, I felt myself drop into my body. It was like I'm not bad. It was like that's why I'm like this. I understood myself in such a deep way that I felt myself drop into my body, just from that understanding.
Thanks for sharing that, Debbie.
Thank you.
Thank you, Debbie. Anna Hallberg wrote to me with a few questions. I wonder if you would like to share. One of them had to do with magical thinking in particular as a survival technique, and also during the therapeutic process of somebody who is undergoing neurofeedback. Do you want to talk about that, Anna, a little bit?
Yes, I can open my mail and see what I wrote.
Oh,
is that
I'm
okay?
sorry. I can also read it. So what you wrote was magic thinking in the process of healing from trauma with or without neurofeedback. I've seen magic thoughts come alive and be the focus of therapy and neurofeedback training for some time until either the person feels no one will believe her or if reality comes alive. Could it be that magic thoughts about connecting with other people, trying to make a wish come alive is the person's brain's way of trying to get the DMN online? Or is it an attachment question? And then there's a little bit of background with a particular, it's almost like a case history here. I don't know how much you want to go into this, but
no, not the case history, maybe not.
Okay, so don't describe that.
No.
Yeah, and I think, Anna, what I wonder is this magical thinking, or is what you're talking about imagination?
Well, when, okay, the patient I had then, she had this, she wanted to send letters, I can say that, to a person that probably would, I mean, she didn't have the address and she didn't know, you know, how to make the stamp or anything. And she wrote the letter, and lots of letters during the time. And she asked me to send them. And I was like, well, I don't have the address and I don't know where to send them. Well, just send them, she said. And it was like, I have this pile of letters. And finally I said, do you think this is magic? Because I thought this was magic to her, that if she wrote these letters, she would connect with this person somehow. And then she lit up and said, yes, exactly, it's magic. I mean, and then we had this conversation about how you really write a letter, and you need an address and a name and everything. I mean, it was the beginning of
connecting, it sounds like.
Yeah, connecting to me and to what she wanted, and what she wrote in those letters, because I didn't understand what she wrote. It was not so, what to say, elaborated, and I think spelling, you know, and so.
And I think just expressing what you want is starting to have a future, right? And starting, right, to make some plans. And I think, yeah. And it obviously worked for her, right?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah. But that was the, like, is that like the DMN is coming, you know, it's hard to say, but it was
hard to say. But, you know, when you think about that, it started to give her a future, right? Making plans, you know, thinking about what she wanted. I would hypothesize that that could have an effect on the default mode network. Okay. And start to reconnect it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. And 𝗖𝗢𝗄𝗯 is, can you hear me, 𝗖𝗢𝗄𝗯?
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Okay, great. So Ruth, I've been actually following your papers in the last few years, and it's just tremendous in terms of the amount of information that you guys generated using fMRI. And of course, you've been using neurofeedback as a way to sort of like probe the brain, and then as an intervention. It is a well-suited, you know, because as you know, with the electrodes and so on. But at the same time, it's like neurofeedback is still a small community, and there are many other, say, protocols out there like EMDR that I wonder. And recently, actually, there's a new protocol called the flash technique, which takes advantage of or attempts to simulate subliminal messaging. But the question really is like, any attempts at your lab to sort of like explore those protocols using fMRI?
Exploring the neurofeedback protocols or the EMDR protocols?
Explore the brain structure or the connectivity. Yeah. When a person was using, let's just say, EMDR or the flash technique, a different protocol other than say neurofeedback.
Yeah, absolutely. And our group has done a mechanistic study looking at what happens when people are engaged in eye movements during traumatic and neutral memories, and versus, you know, clients who aren't traumatized and who don't have post-traumatic stress. Yeah, so we're very much interested in a variety of therapeutic modalities and really tracking how different therapeutic modalities can change brain connectivity and also change bodily responses. That's very much an interest of our group. Okay. Yeah.
Very good.
Thank you, Siklam. There is a question from Rachel. Are you on the line? Can you hear me?
I can't see Rachel.
I'm here, but I'm just nervous to talk in person. So that's why I put
If
it
you
in
like,
the
I can
chat.
read your question. That's fine.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for this discussion and opportunity. Could you speak a little about how arousal versus attention versus brainwave states, alpha, beta, theta, all relate to salience and default mode networks?
Yeah, very important question, and that's a whole separate webinar. But yeah, arousal, I think, is absolutely critical in its relationship to attention. And I think both too much and too little arousal can really affect attention quite significantly. And I think arousal can affect the alpha band, it can affect the beta band and the theta band as well. And I think all those are very intricately connected in really shaping how the salience network can function at any given time. So that's just a very short answer to a very complex question, but thanks, Rachel.
Do you have a paper or book that you would recommend to get a better sense of putting all those pieces together?
God, there's a number of papers. Send me an email and I can send some of them to you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
And there's a comment, thank you, Rachel. There's a comment here from 𝗓𝗂𝗏. I don't know if I'm saying your name correctly. Would you like to speak, Ken, or would you like me to read your statement?
Please read it, thank you.
Okay. I'm fascinated with your linking eye contact, seeing, being seen, and mentalization, knowing your own and others' mind. As it relates to shame, e.g. stain on the soul. My question is really, is merely feel free to talk more about any of the above, particularly with regard to shame and the brain.
Yeah, and that's a big topic as well. That's just beginning to be studied, and our group has some new data on what the effects are when we recall shameful events. And what we're finding is that a part of the brain called the posterior insula really activates with shame, and that's a region that sort of gets in touch with our visceral sensations. And when we feel that pit in our stomach, or when we feel self-disgust, that's an area that becomes very active. I think when we think about shame, we've always thought that, higher brain structures like the frontal cortex are involved because, we judge ourselves, we say, I am bad. But I think, again, we've ignored the body, which is so much part of shame, right? I mean, people are torn apart when they feel those feelings of shame. It's really gnawing at individuals. And I think that's what this posterior insula really does. And so we'll be talking quite a bit about that in the webinar. So thanks for bringing that up, Ken.
This is interesting to me because somehow it relates for me to this idea of attachment, how, having a relationship, that's really this core need for humans, isn't it? To be related to others. And if you feel so shamed that you are pulling yourself out of the human community that you could otherwise be in, you feel that level of self-disgust. That's a little bit of what you're talking about there, right?
Absolutely. I think it really alienates you, right? Absolutely. And hence, the shame posture is a posture where you look down, which actually prevents you from connecting. Right?
Mm. So let's see. This is from Catherine Lewis. Catherine, would you like to ask your own question? Or would you like me to read it? Can you hear me? She may not still be on. I'll just read the question.
No, you can just go ahead and read it. I'm sorry,
Okay,
Lawrence,
all right.
please.
Thank you, Catherine. Could you talk about adolescents who have experienced trauma and how the DMN is just coming online during adolescence? Oh, how would the DMN coming online during adolescence affects their treatment?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think what comes online also, in late adolescence is, more moral reasoning, which I think is also very much connected to the default mode network. And what we see in traumatized individuals in adulthood, we have compared their default mode network connectivity to the normal development of the default mode network. And what seems to be happening is that the default mode network in traumatized individuals is similar to a default network in 7 to 9-year-olds. And so, I think this poses really important questions on how early life trauma affects the development of that default mode network, and how we then can really get the default mode network to connect those parts that are disconnected so the person can have a future, the person can know what they feel, because you need to know what you feel in order to mentalize and know what the other person feels. And so when this default mode network is offline, all those things are becoming much more difficult. And I think people really have to make a tremendous effort to do this. I'm not sure whether this completely answers your question, Catherine, about adolescence, but I think it just makes everything much more difficult.
Yes, it does, Ruth. Thank you so much for answering that. And hearing that it's like a 7 to 9-year-old in an adult, the default mode network, that's incredible. And that really helps me understand how to deal with adolescents who've had trauma. Helps me understand a lot better. I think that's a really good piece of information.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much for answering that. Yeah.
The other interesting and somewhat hopeful part of looking at that implication there is that rather than thinking of trauma as a damage to a person, the way that you're describing it is as a developmental delay. Am I right about that? Is that?
Yeah, I'd be careful with that. Yes, I think, especially when it relating to the default mode network, it could be seen like that. But I think, and I want to stress what we talked about earlier, I think these adaptations to trauma, that the brain engages in are the definition of resilience, right? Because they can really help the individual to survive. So, I don't see traumatized individuals as developmentally delayed at all. They've adapted to deal with the impossible, right? And their brains, minds, and bodies have managed to do that. The downside of that is that the individual still feels like the past is very much present in the here and now, and that's what we have to overcome. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. There is a question a little further back here. Could the inability, this is Zena Doherty, feel free to speak up if you like. Could the inability to identify self-worth or goals and life values be an indicator of the offline presence of the DMN?
Partly, yeah, because that's very much part of a sense of self. I think there's more areas involved with that, especially, some very deep areas of the reptilian brain that deal with raw affective responses. But again, they feed into the sense of self, into the default mode network, and I think can color the way we view ourselves. And we'll be talking about that as well.
Ruth, can I ask you a question?
Sure.
So just following on what Catherine was asking about, and I just wondered if in adults, and you're looking mostly at adult brains, is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
You're seeing this, well, I know you're trying to avoid language, but let's just, it's me, not you speaking, instead of some developmental lag of the full of being of the default mode network. And that's looks to be between 7 and 9, and that's interestingly because that seems, if I just think about a number of my patients, that's a good, it's sort of early mastery, trying to figure out, sort of how the world works, and there are analogies anyway. But what I'm thinking about, I've worked most of my career with disturbed adolescents, is whether if you were to look at an adolescent brain, if you would hypothesize that you would see even a younger developmental consequence or whatever of the default mode network. Do you have a thought about that?
It's an interesting question. Yeah, it may be even younger, right?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
My hunch is that it would be younger.
Yeah.
It would be a very important thing to look at, because it's all talked about, I think, as the lack of prefrontal cortex.
Yeah.
And that's true too, but there's a very strong implication of your work anyway that suggests that traumatized adolescents are not where their default mode network is would be a very important finding, I think.
Yeah, it would be really, really interesting to track that, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's also this strange latency that everybody talks about, that having been traumatized as a child, and that really only coming online as a problem for many kids, not for every kid, but for many kids in adolescence, right? That they don't seem to be feeling the brunt of the trauma until they reach adolescence, usually later adolescence.
Yeah.
I mean, 𝗙𝗂𝗃 talks a lot about that.
Absolutely.
So this would be a terrific, because we're all going to come up with ideas for what you to do with your research and your fMRI. So that's my vote.
No, I think that's a great vote. I vote yes as well.
Okay, great.
Ruth, just off of Seaburn, that question, or what we're talking about, has to do with that treatment of traumatized young children.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of treatment going around for 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9-year-old kids that, I mean, I've had some of them as adolescents who have had treatment all that time. And I'm not saying the treatment doesn't work, because I've treated that young child too. But I am saying that all those big issues are still there. And of course, they're even bigger by adolescents.
Yeah.
And so this brings a lot, this is what I'm talking about. How is this going to affect treatment? And I couldn't express that very well in the question. But I think this is a huge issue in terms of treatment of younger children on into adolescence.
And of course, in adolescence, you also get all those hormonal changes.
Yes.
Right? And how do they affect brain connectivity? And I think that's a very important thing to think about as well, right? And we know that, for example, in traumatized girls, through Frank Putnam's work, that their testosterone level is higher, right? And so how does that affect connectivity of the brain, right? I think these are all critical questions, and I think, there's going to be a multifactorial answer, right?
Yeah. Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for all the great questions. Ruth, I wonder if you want to talk a little bit about what the motivation for you doing this course is, and what you personally are hoping to see come out of it. I feel like you talked about it a little bit in that you about developing the sort of library bedrock of questions that are coming up around neuroscience and clinical neurofeedback and therapy. Could you talk a bit about that?
Yeah, I think it is really to make this work more accessible, and to really find the best language to communicate this work. And as we talked about before, is really bringing together people with lived experience, therapists and researchers, to have, you know, discussions on where did we go from here, what do we think is important to study, and what has worked and what hasn't worked, and, you know, how can we really facilitate this work, and how can we also bring more and more hope to traumatized individuals, you know, because we can now show, we all know this as therapists, that we can change these brain networks because we see it clinically, but also, you know, how can we keep showing this and to, you know, really give hope for the treatment for these often very complex disorders and difficulties. I hate calling it disorders, but difficulties.
That's great. Thank you. We had scheduled this from 3 to 4 today, and I want to be mindful of the other commitments that people have. Thank you very much, Ruth, and to everyone who came today. Please feel free to write to me, info@eeglearn.com, and let us know what you thought about today. If there are questions that are still lingering that you would like to get answered, if you have feedback or ideas about things that we should be paying attention to.
May I also suggest, Lars, that people tell their friends about this course, as it's starting up for real next week, and they won't have missed anything if they start next week at 3 on Tuesday.
And thanks everyone for coming, and thank you, Lars, for facilitating.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone.
Take care and stay safe.